And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Tonight we've got a returning guest from last week, and frankly I've been looking forward to this radio show all week because we just barely scratched the surface of the issue of the regulatory state. And what the guest that we have is Harriet Hageman. Harriet is a constitutional lawyer. She specializes in the areas of water and property rights, and she is very, very tuned in on the regulatory state. She does a terrific presentation in that regard. And Harriet, I welcome you to the show, and I ask that you maybe do a short recap of what we discussed last week and maybe a 5-minute summary of how the regulatory state has captured our federal government's legislative functions.
Well, thank you, Dan, and it's good to be back with everyone. I appreciate you, and I appreciate your listeners in this opportunity to discuss something that I find to be very troubling in terms of what has happened over the last 40, 50, 60 years with the expansion of the executive branch, if you will, at the expense of the other two branches of government. And what I have found in the research that I have done is that through the regulatory regime, if you will, our federal government is essentially acting extra constitutionally, if you will. The executive branch has taken more and more and more power through regulatory agencies and through the adoption of rules and regulations versus through what is the standard process and what is provided for in our Constitution, which is that it is the legislative branch that is supposed to be legislating. What I have found, because of the work that I have done as a practicing attorney, is that these agencies anymore are doing the vast majority of the lawmaking in this country. And just to give you an example, I did some research just today. I'm going to be speaking on Saturday at the Western Conservative Summit, and I did some research just today updating my speech and my information. And just to give you an idea of the difference is that despite the fact that it is Congress that is supposed to be writing the laws, right now in 2006, Congress passed 214 laws, whereas there were 3,853 new regulations adopted by federal agencies. That's about a ratio of 18-1, meaning for every law that is passed by Congress through regular order, we have 18 regulations that are adopted and imposed by nameless, faceless bureaucrats that live in these agencies and work in these agencies and whose sole responsibility is to try to find ways to regulate us. As I've indicated before, I think one of the primary job responsibilities of a regulator is to protect their job. And as a result, they regulate, and regulate more, and then regulate more and regulate more on top of that. What is important about that for a lot of people who don't understand is that these regulations that are adopted through the Administrative Procedures Act, they have the force and effect of law. So if I do something that may not violate a statute, if it violates a regulation, I can be prosecuted. I can be civilly prosecuted. I can be criminally prosecuted under such laws as the Clean Water Act. So when you have the EPA that is doing just putting out thousands of regulations and that cost literally tens of billions of dollars in terms of our economic output in this country, those agencies have the authority to criminalize my conduct, even if Congress didn't. Now, they will always say, well, the intent of the Clean Water Act was to do blah, 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 but that isn't. And we know that because of the mechanism by which they're attempting to use the Clean Air Act to adopt basically a cap-and-trade type scheme using the Clean Air Act to impose rules and regulations to address global warming and to further such things as the Paris Climate Accord. Even though they can't get those laws, they can't get cap and trade through Congress. So really what we talked about last week was just what I have learned, what I have found over the last 7 years primarily, actually starting in about 2002 when I was working on the roadless rule and looking at the nature in which the Forest Service was denying access, management, and use to, at that time, 58.5 million acres, where Congress never lifted a finger to do it. But through a regulation, through a rulemaking, the Forest Service was actually able to deny our ability to use almost 1/3 of our National Forest Service lands. So you can see the impact that these regulatory agencies have, yet they're not accountable to us. And in some forms of government, maybe that's okay, like totalitarian regimes. But in a republic, that's not okay. The very concept of a republic, the very foundation of our government, is representation. We fought a revolutionary war over it. It was called taxation without representation. And our forefathers said, you cannot tax us if we do not have a say in our government. And we fought a bloody battle, and we gained our independence. And one of the foundations of our government is that our representatives represent us, and we have a say in our government. We don't work for the government works for us. But through these regulatory agencies, it's actually been turned around, where the agencies use citizens to amass more and more and more power, more and more and more money, more and more employees, and it just goes on and on and on. And I personally think it's breaking our country. In 2016, just as of today, looking at the numbers, the total cost of federal regulations in 2016 was $1.963 trillion. That is a hidden tax, if you will, against every citizen in this country, because that is what we have to pay in increased costs for goods and services and those sorts of things, because these are federal regulatory agencies that are demanding that Peabody Coal, for example, or Arch Coal, or a builder, or a UP Railroad, or whatever company it may be, that they comply with these rules and regulations, and there's a very serious cost to that. In fact, the administration of that regulatory burden is $63 billion. In other words, our federal government spends $63 billion of our money to enforce regulations against us that are largely unconstitutional. Because they are outside of the legislative branch, and that is something that I feel that we desperately need to fix.
No, there's no question about that, Harriet. I'm a commercial building contractor by profession, and one of the things that came out of a recent study by the National Association of Home Builders, now this is home builders, it isn't commercial, but at the same time, I think commercial, the costs are actually higher than this. But in residential construction, 25% of the cost of a residential project is as a result of regulatory expansion. That means that if you have a $200,000 home, $150,000 of that is what that house should actually cost, but it's costing an extra $50,000 just because of the regulations. That's just unforgivable, and no wonder our country's having financial problems.
Well, and it's no wonder that the foundation of our country isn't moving. And by foundation, what I'm talking about is the people that really do drive the economic well-being of this country. The number of millions of hours of paperwork, it's not just the economic impact of it, but it's literally millions and millions and millions of hours of paperwork that these various agencies are required to comply with. And it is, it also, I think one of the other things that bothers me so much is the level of disdain with which these regulators view the people who are actually paying their salaries. And I'm just going to give you an example, going back to the building issue that you just identified. There is a federal worker safety law that includes some 4,000 rules dictating precisely what equipment shall be used and how facilities are built. Obviously, those regulations have a cost. Those rules have a cost when they have to be implemented. One of the things that is included in those rules is a statement that stairways shall be lit by natural and artificial illumination. And we all sit back and say, oh, okay, that makes sense, but here's my question. What other options do we have?
Really?
And why do we need a regulatory agency telling us that our stairwells need to be lit? Mm-hmm. And we can laugh at that because it's so absurd that we have people that we're paying very high salaries, by the way. Most federal employees make substantially higher salaries than in private industry in comparable positions, substantially mm-hmm. higher. So we're paying people a substantial amount of money to treat us as though we're all dumber than a rock. Mm-hmm. I can assure you that builders know that when they build a stairwell, they're either going to have windows or they're going to have a light. And if they didn't figure it out before they built the stairwell, at some point they would. Yet we've got regulators that have such horrific disdain for the builders in this country that they write regulations like that. That goes back to what I was saying earlier. The number one job of many of these regulators is keeping their jobs. They have to regulate and regulate and regulate and regulate more, because at some point somebody may say, really, what are you sitting in that chair for? And that's their fear.
That's a good question. Yeah, we have to wonder why they are sitting in that chair.
They're sitting in that chair because we've created a new welfare state. The welfare state is federal employees, and we have essentially two categories of welfare recipients in this country at that level, and we have people who truly do need help, and I'm one who feels that we should be helping the weakest among us, and that we should. There are a lot of people who need a hand up, and I think that we do that. It should be done at the state level, not at the federal level. But setting that aside for a moment, but what you also have is you have massive bureaucracies that they spend as much time making sure that they're protecting their jobs by imposing restrictions against us, by taking away constitutional rights, by adopting rules and regulations that are incredibly destructive to our economy and our philosophy, our very foundation of government, our constitutional republic, as they do actually doing something good. And I know that it is tough for some federal employees to hear that, and I have spoken at various events where there are federal employees, and I can tell you I'm not exactly the most popular person in the room, but we've created a monstrosity that needs to be addressed, and we're going to have to address it head on.
Right. No, I agree with that. Well, Harriet, last week we touched on the overreach by agencies like the EPA, and I'd like to tonight, let's speak specifically about the land agencies, like the BLM and Forest Service, and how they use the Endangered Species Act and clean water regulations and dust mitigation and all this stuff to destroy small farming and ranching operations in the West.
Well, there's no question that is the case. What you look at let's take the Forest Service and talk about it in particular. The Forest Service was created in 1896 under the Organic Act, and it was created in the Department of Ag, not in the Department of Interior. And it was put there because the national forests, which are 192 million acres, primarily in the western United States and the state of Alaska, although there are some Forest Service lands east of the Mississippi, there are very few, but they were in the west, and they were identified basically as a commodity. And those lands were to be managed as a continuous supply of timber and a continuous supply of water, because so many of our National Forest Service lands are in the mountainous Rocky Mountain region. We now, in large part, manage them as national parks. They were never intended to be that. It's a violation of the Organic Act. It's a violation of the very purpose for which these lands were set aside and why the national forests were created. But we know we're not grazing them. We're not managing those resources the way that we should. And as a result, we've actually destroyed our national forests. And that's why I talk about the financial aspect of the rules and regulations, but it's not just economic. And where I will describe this and go into some detail, because oftentimes when I give this speech, I'm not able to go into this in the detail that I would like to. Well, when I was handling the roadless lawsuit in the early 2000s, one of the things that I did was get the entire administrative record related to Bill Clinton's effort to deny access, management, and use, as I said, to 58.5 million acres under the roadless rule. There were 2 GAO studies that were issued in 1999 and 2000 because Congress at the time actually sought to exercise some of its authority by saying, wait a minute, we don't think that you have the authority to do this under the National Forest Management Act or any of those things. So they had 2 GAO reports. One of the other things that came out is that many of the regional Forest Service employees were adamantly opposed to the roadless rule. And they were opposed to it because they recognized that with such large swaths of land, they were never going to be able to manage the resources to protect the ecological values of those resources. They knew that they were going to have problems with catastrophic forest fires, all of which has come true. They knew that they were going to have problems with the pine beetle outbreak, all of which has come true. They knew that if Washington, D.C. took over control from these local areas, it was going to be catastrophic, and in fact it has been. And I'll read to you some things that came out of what that was discussed in one of the GAO reports from way back then. This one, I believe, is the April 1999 GAO report. And it talks about the proposed roadless rule takes an approach to decision-making on road construction in roadless areas that is different from the approaches of other recent Forest Service proposed rules, strategies, and plans. The proposed rule, which the agency asserts would supersede relevant portions of existing plans and transportation management regulations, would apply a nationwide prohibition on road construction in roadless areas, even if local conditions suggest that a road would help the agency to restore and maintain desired ecological conditions. In other words, so we can have one-size-fits-all rule coming out of Washington, D.C., we are going to destroy the environment. And so when people always are talking to me about, oh, well, gosh, we've got to have these federal agencies doing this, and we need to protect the national forests, and we need to do all of these things, and people will destroy the environment if we don't have all these regulations and if we don't stop all this use, they're the ones that were responsible for it. They destroyed our national forests. And it goes on and it says the exceptions would not authorize road construction or reconstruction in inventoried roadless areas to restore and maintain ecological sustainability. National forests could generally not construct a road to thin strands of trees and mechanically remove underbrush and dead vegetation to reduce the risk of uncontrollable and potentially catastrophic fire or to improve the forest's resistance to insects and disease that otherwise could kill trees and add to fuel loads. And then it went on, and it said, officials on several national forests included in our review voiced concerns about the long-term impacts of the roadless rule. Officials on the Route National Forest, which is in northern Colorado, anticipate an outbreak of pine beetles resulting from a catastrophic windstorm in 1997 that felled 13,000 acres of mostly spruce and fir trees in or adjacent to roadless areas on the forest. They believe that the preferred alternative would not allow them to construct the roads necessary to remove trees in roadless areas that in the future may become infected by the beetles currently living within this deadfall. Therefore, they would be unable to protect highly valued resources such as scenic areas and adjacent campgrounds and ski slopes. They knew that there was going to be a pine beetle outbreak. They knew that the roadless rule was going to destroy their ability to address it, and they adopted the roadless rule anyway. And if you go to northern Colorado, southern Wyoming, much of Wyoming, national parks, national forests, all across the interior west, ground zero was Route National Forest. So there's the economic component of this, but there's truly the environmental component as well. And we have agencies that are doing things and adopting rules and imposing rules and regulations that are destroying our environment.
Right. Well, and they claim their rules are to protect the environment when in fact the exact opposite, as you pointed out, are happening. But that came with Bill Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development that was created in 1994. And I'd like you to talk maybe to our listeners about how those so-called sustainability rules turn government from the servant of the people to the master by making serving the environment a much more important priority than serving people.
Well, I think that you just said it. I think that that is just the reality. And again, it goes back to the mindset. When you are looking at land use management, land use and management through the prism of sitting in an office building in Washington, D.C., you truly have no concept of what you're doing. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude, and I'm sure some of these are nice people. But you can't sit in Washington, D.C. and make land use planning for millions of acres throughout the interior West. It's stupid. It's silly. It's counterproductive. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work because it hasn't worked. So it is exactly what you say. What you've got is people graduating from these universities with degrees in environmental studies or in hydrology or in silviculture or these things, but they're being hired by agencies. They're sitting in an office. They're looking at a computer screen and they're trying to figure out, okay, where are their wetlands? Where are what areas are we going to protect? And they don't have any on-the-ground experience. And as a result, they are doing a really bad job in terms of managing our resources. They also have a bizarre view that this is natural. And I have a book that I often take with me, and I don't know if I grabbed it when I was sitting here, but there is a book that was a photo book that shows, it's about Custer traveling across the western United States in the 1860s. And a gentleman went back to, they have the original photographs from 140 years ago, 50 years ago, and then they went back and took modern day photographs. And what's very interesting is that the forests that he traveled through looked dramatically different between when they were in their so-called natural condition in the 1860s versus where they are now. And one of the things that's so striking is that they are so much more dense. They are so much more monolithic. They're unhealthy today. Yet environmentalists look at that and say, "Oh, that's a really good forest. Look at that tree cover. Look at that canopy cover. Look at all of those trees," not recognizing that that is absolutely a conflagration waiting to happen. That isn't the natural condition. Yet so what they're doing is not only did we go off the deep end in terms of this alleged obsession with protecting our environment, we did it at the very time that so many of these national forests were already at the breaking point in terms of overgrowth, undergrowth, being improperly managed, and all of those things.
Right. Well, you're right. And the thing that's people don't realize is that with their failure to cut and thin and do the natural processes that in times past were taken care of by wildfire, that's why we have these huge catastrophic wildfires, is because so little of the canopy has been broken that when we do get a fire, it literally is a crown fire for thousands and thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of acres.
Yeah, and it's such a bizarre approach that our Forest Service looks at that and says, yeah, well, that's kind of a natural condition, but it isn't. And it's not a natural condition for a lot of reasons. When we use the terminology catastrophic forest fire, that's actually a term of art. We're not just saying, man, this thing is really, really bad. What it means is that they burn so hot that they sterilize the soils. When they sterilize the soils, vegetation won't grow. So if you'll go back to the 1990s, there were a couple of catastrophic forest fires that were west of Denver. One of them was actually started by a Forest Service employee when she started a fire, and it was a very dry period of time. She started a fire. It was the Hayman Fire, I believe was the name of it. And it was catastrophic. That area is never revegetated because it can't, because the soils have been sterilized. Now, that's what's so significant about this is the continuous problem that you then have with erosion and all of those things. So as a water attorney, I'm very cognizant and very concerned about watersheds and very concerned about what's happening at the top of the watershed, if you will, up there in the national forest, because anything that happens up there is going to be visited on us down below. And soot, soils, sediment, runoff, all of those things, degradation of the watersheds, all go along with those catastrophic forest fires. So again, picking on the Forest Service, but they deserve it. they have done a poor job of managing this resource. And they have done it going back to what you said a moment ago, which is sustainability, whatever that term means. Sustainability and protecting the environment. And we can't allow for logging because it destroys the national forest and blah, 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 blah. None of which is true.
Right.
It's the exact opposite.
And I'm not a person to be a defender of the Forest Service, but part of the reason for so much of the Forest Service refusing to allow contractors to go in and cut logs and stuff has to do with the Equal Access to Justice Act, which most of the environmental groups are the ones that have pushed that lobby to get that law passed. And in fact, many of the environmental groups make a living off of those lawsuits to shut down logging contracts on federal forest land. And obviously, they know that they're hurting the environment. So if protecting the environment is really what they're all about, they gave that up a long time ago. Now they're in it for the money.
I think that that's very true. In fact, it's one of the ways by which these various agencies launder money through environmental groups. What you have is they're sue and settle. So you have a situation where the local agency did something wrong in terms of letting a contract for a particular area for logging or for grazing. You can have it for sheep grazing and claims that allowing for sheep grazing could potentially affect bighorn sheep. So you have all of these allegations. And what happens is they sue the federal government or sue that agency. The agency, through the Department of Justice, settles the case after a certain period of time. And then the enviros file what are called a petition for equal access to justice funds. What that says is that if you sue the federal government or the federal government sues you and the federal government's position was not, quote, substantially justified, then you get your attorney's fees and costs. What I have found from personal experience is the only time that the agencies will readily enter into stipulations giving you your fees and costs is if you are an environmental group. I have personal experience with that with my own clients where I beat the federal government. I beat the federal government on a fairly regular basis on a variety of issues. I file my petition with the court to get EAJA funds, and those agencies fight me to the death. That my clients, my individuals, are not entitled to that money. I had a case that the EPA persecuted one of my clients several years ago over he moved an irrigation ditch. I talked about this a bit last time. He moved an irrigation ditch on his private property. That case cost him $1 million between attorney's fees and expert witness fees. We won. Hands down, we won. They fought us tooth and nail on getting EAJA funds, and the district court judge rejected it. Yet I've seen circumstance where they have paid environmental groups hundreds of thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars an hour, $600-700 an hour in these sue and settle cases, and the district courts will approve them. So it's laundering money. What it does is it gets federal funds into these environmental groups' pockets: Earth Justice, Sierra Club, NRDC. I'll name them. The Western Watersheds Project, all of them. That's what this is about, is money.
I've seen it myself, and I know you're exactly right. As a county commissioner, I saw those very things happen time after time. And it was always interesting to me that the federal agencies, when someone at the top of the federal agencies, the administration changed and they lost their job, they just went for the environmental groups. It was like musical chairs.
They come from the environmental groups and they go back to the environmental groups. When I was trying the roadless lawsuit, I did get discovery of the feds and some of the enviros. But one of them that I deposed was the head of, the CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, the cabinet-level environmental person in D.C. And I believe he came from the World Wildlife Fund, and when he was done after Bill Clinton, I think he either went back to that one or another one. That's just what they do. It's revolving doors, and that's why the policies are what they are. And it's why we've really, really substantially damaged our environment in the western United States. I drive through these national forests, And knowing what I know from that lawsuit from 2001 and being in the middle of that and diving deep down into that administrative record and knowing that they knew that that was an unlawful rule, it was the largest one in the history of the United States at that time, and we needed to win that. We did win it at the district court level. At the appellate level, we did not. But it was, I think, it was one of those very critical moments in our history where if an agency can make a decision that is of that magnitude, in terms of geographic scope, in terms of monetary impacts, in terms of impacts to states, in terms of sucking all of the power back into Washington, D.C., regardless of the environmental and financial impact. I think that empowered agencies and led them to believe, man, we can't be stopped.
Yeah,
it was really a critical moment in time.
And the thing is, Harriet, this is, and I did want to touch on this, but this is all part of UN Agenda 21 and 2030. And on the wildlands map, 50% of the United States is designated as wilderness with no humans allowed, with another 30 or 35% of the U.S. shown as very limited human activity. And, a very small part of the country is supposed to be normal use by humans. And this is all part of UN Agenda 21, which is intended to create global government and take away all local governments and even national sovereignty. So, this stuff is coming from just about everywhere, and it astounds me that so many of our political leaders are so willing to jump on that bandwagon.
I think that your latter comment is the one that's so troubling to me. I will be perfectly honest with you. I haven't studied Agenda 21 or Agenda 30 that extensively, and here's why. I don't need to necessarily know where that's coming from, because I can point to the agencies and I can point to Congress and say, you are abdicating your responsibility and you are committing legislative malpractice by not reining in these agencies and not reining in their authority. Because we could stop it. Congress could stop this tomorrow.
Sure.
We've got a president right now who's willing to do it, and I'm hoping over the next 8 years we can accomplish some things in that regard. But it's interesting that that's where we want to go. And I've looked at the wildlands map. I've got it, I think, probably in my notebook sitting right here. Anybody who ever studied Sudan can understand the danger associated with that. And I think one of the things that really troubles me is that people don't understand history, and they don't understand truly what happens when you attempt to urbanize your entire population, which is what that is. What that map shows is urbanizing our population.
Yep.
But go back to Sudan in the 1980s and early 1990s, late 70s, and what you have is you have a despot that went in and basically urbanized the population and put everybody in refugee camps. And that country is, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the word, it is hell on earth. And it is because over 90% of the foodstuff that comes into Sudan has to be imported because they no longer have farmers. They no longer raise any of their food. They are completely food dependent on bringing food in. So whenever that leader or whatever the new leader is wants to control his masses, he starves them. You don't want to be food dependent. One of the very last things you would ever want to do is be food dependent. Yet Sudan is an example of what happens when you urbanize your population. And Sudan doesn't have 330 million people. We have 330 million people. If anybody were ever dumb enough to actually attempt to implement that wildlands map, first of all, it would be absolute chaos, and they'd never get it done. You would truly have a war on your hands if you were going to do that. But the concept is to urbanize people, and you make them completely dependent upon the government. And we can look at Sudan, and we know the outcome.
Well, and we can look at Venezuela and see the outcome, because that's exactly what's happened there.
Yes.
Yeah,
so yes, there are people that they did, and I always wonder who they are and why. I think about it, and I think about this beautiful life that I have and that we have because we live in a free country. I can dress the way that I want to. I can make the decision to become an attorney. There's really no limits on what I can do within the framework of the laws and the Constitution. And I'm not somebody who breaks the laws. I'm somebody who complies with them. So I should have a lot of autonomy to succeed in what I choose to do. My brothers and their family as ranchers and stewards of the land should have a lot of autonomy to do what they do. We are happy people, and we have a government that truly wants to alter that, and it makes no sense to me.
No, it doesn't. It never has made any sense. It's all about power and consolidation of power.
It is. But I always wonder, what is the purpose of power in and of itself? Maybe I'm silly. I mean, maybe I'm stupid. Maybe that's a very stupid question. But I look at the Paris Climate Accord. I'm looking at some data right now. And this is stuff that they admit. I'm not making this stuff up. This is the people who are advocates of the Paris Climate Accord admit, even if every nation adhered to its commitments by 2030, the only difference in global warming by the end of the century will be to reduce the world's temperature by 0.048 degrees Celsius, which is 0.086 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 1/20th of a degree Celsius, and the estimated cost is $1.5 trillion. Who would do something that dumb?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And not only that, but physicists all over the world are talking about us being in a solar minimum right now, and the fact that we're actually going through some form of global cooling.
Well, I know. And so what we know is that they've cooked the books, and they've cooked the books for years, and you wonder why. I mean, that's what I always come back to. I'm always trying to figure out motivation, because if I figure out motivation, it can help me to be a more effective attorney, whether it's, deposing someone or whatever it may be. And the motivation for global warming, as you say, is just pure unadulterated power. But to what end? I can't even imagine that Maduro in Venezuela is having much fun, is he?
Well, you never know.
Who could have fun watching that pure, abject misery?
Well, these people are, and we have to understand one thing. These people are, even the President of the United States, he's a secondary player in this thing. The reality is there's just a handful of people at the very top of the control mechanism of the world, and they really, truly do believe that they are the only ones that have the intelligence and that they should really, truly control the world. Now, we could get into that esoteric discussion, and we could go on through at least another 10 or 15 programs like this. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about, and this is an area where I think our listeners are very interested. You're familiar with the Bundy standoff, the Malheur and Finicum tragedies, and the facts that the government agencies present are totally different than the actual facts. They're totally separate things. We've created land agencies now, federal land agencies, that are fully militarized.
Yes.
And many things are going on in our country that are designed to implement this wildlands map, because in reality they want to force people off the land. Now, in the Bundy case, 56 ranchers had been run off of their property because of the reduction in grazing leases and all the others. Bundys were the last family standing against the takeover of that part of Nevada. And obviously there's a real problem when we start losing all of our ranchers and our farmers, as you indicated. They're the breadbasket of the country.
Yep.
Talk to us a little bit about how the government is using water, it's using grazing leases, it's using all these things to reduce the ability of farmers and ranchers in the West to be able to be productive and make a living on their land.
Well, again, you've set it up, and what you've said is exactly what's happening. Anything that has to do with something that's associated with Harry Reid should make everybody raise an eyebrow, because that man is just corrupt beyond corrupt. and it was obvious while he was in the Senate, and it continues to be obvious to this day. And there is something behind that. When I watched all of that play out, what stunned me was the manner in which we have weaponized our federal government against citizens. My view of all of that was that that was a dispute between what are essentially two landowners. The BLM is simply a landowner. That's it.
Right.
And the Bundys were also landowners and permit holders. And so I am not allowed to pull a gun on somebody and shoot them or tase them on a trespass. I called the sheriff, and the sheriff addresses the situation. We don't believe in that kind of self-help. Yet when it comes to a federal agency, we've armed those people. And as they say in books, and I'm a voracious writer, but the old adage is that if there's ever a gun that is talked about in a book, at some point it's going to be used. You can't ever talk about or write about a gun in a book unless it's eventually used, and that's kind of how I feel what's happening with our federal government. Once somebody's got a gun, that the risk of that agent doing something really stupid escalates dramatically, and it happened there. I don't know why they want the Bundys off that land. I don't know what that battle is, other than I have about the same information that you do. But I can give you other examples of where our federal agencies are going after the ag industry specifically.
Okay, good.
One of them is looking at fees imposed on cattle. They've been talking for years about imposing a methane fee on cattle that it would be $20 a head, $40 a head, $5 a head. I don't know what it would be, but our agencies have talked, EPA and the Radical Enviros and the Department of Ag have talked for years about imposing a methane gas emission tax against livestock. Another thing that they've done is in 2012, the Department of Labor adopted a regulation that they were going to make it illegal for anyone under 16 years old to work on a farm or a ranch. Now, first of all, how an agency would have the authority to criminalize that is just shocking to me. But I grew up on a ranch.
Yeah.
And I grew up.
I did too. Yeah.
Starting at a very young age, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. We helped move cows, we helped fix fence, and it did a lot of things. It gave us an incredible work ethic. We were in an integral part of the ranch. We were an incredibly important part of the ranch. It made it so that it was affordable to continue ranching at times like when Jimmy Carter had 18% interest and 18% inflationary rates. I mean, those are the things. But if you've got a government agency that says your kids can't work on your farm or ranch, you're going to break every farm and ranch in the country. And the other thing to keep in mind about that is you could only selectively enforce it. So that is a mechanism by which these agencies and the federal government can actually punish enemies, such as a Harriet Hageman who may speak out. They're not going to be able to go to every ranch and determine whether a kid at 12 years old is helping to irrigate, but they can go after somebody and individuals that they want to punish to prevent them from speaking out. So it's a freedom of speech issue, it's a freedom of religion issue, it's an economic issue, it's all of those things. And there was such an outcry, and Obama was running for re-election, so they immediately withdrew it because they were afraid it might have an effect on his re-election. But I don't have any delusions that the Department of Labor isn't going to roll that puppy out again in the future. That's another one. We have attacks on the First Amendment. The USDA has threatened to shut down farms for that have employees that may have conservative articles in the break room, because in some of these areas you have federal employees or federal inspectors that come in all the time, and they have threatened to shut down farms for having conservative information available to employees. We have a situation where the EPA has issued what they refer to as their scientific analysis, which is anything but. That's just the nice little title that they put on it. But they claim that they're entitled to regulate water quantity, which has always been reserved to the states and state engineers and DNRs and those things. Always, for hundreds of years, been reserved to the states. The EPA claims that it can now administer water quantity in the interest of protecting water quality, even though not one word of the Clean Water Act has been changed to give them that authority. I've got a circumstance where a family was subjected to fines of $3.9 million for failing to have the proper permit for selling pet rabbits. USDA issued them a notice of violation and stated that they were subject to fines of $3.9 million. I think they made like $120.
Wow.
So, these are agencies that truly are astoundingly dangerous in terms of what they believe their authority to be and what they believe that they can do to people. Because being an attorney who works for some of these folks, what happens when you receive a notice of violation is you receive this letter from the EPA and it says you have violated the Clean Water Act. You are guilty as charged. You have 7 days or 10 days to notify us that you are going to cooperate with us, or you will be subject to fines of $37,500 a day.
Mm-hmm.
You're sitting there as a farmer or a rancher, you're looking at losing everything you've ever worked for, and you're immediately going to try to find some way to solve that.
Right.
And so, our Congress has given these agencies totalitarian authority, and that's wrong, and it needs to change.
Absolutely. And the thing is people have to understand that Congress didn't do anything, and that's the problem. They should have stopped these agencies a long time ago.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I think that actually a lot of folks in Congress, they'll talk a good game about regulations and all of that stuff, they actually want to turn a blind eye to some of these agencies. And I'm going to read you something that came from the 2016 10,000 Commandments, which is put out by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a fabulous organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Quote, mounting pressures to restrain spending budgets can incentivize lawmakers to impose off-budget regulations on the private sector rather than add to unpopular deficit spending. Unlike on-budget spending, the regulatory costs remain largely hidden from public view, a feature that can make regulation overly attractive to lawmakers. So what they've done is, rather than pay directly and book expenses for new initiatives, federal regulations can compel the private sector as well as state and local governments to bear the costs of federal initiative. It's one of those unfunded mandates. It's behind the scenes. People don't know it. The regulatory burden, as I said a moment ago, for 2016 was $1.963 trillion. If it were a government, it would be, I think it's the 5th largest government in the world in 2016, the 7th largest. If U.S. regulations were a country, they would have been the 7th largest economy, ranked between India and Italy in 2016. Okay, somebody, that has to stop.
Yeah, it has to. It has
That's
to.
insane.
And the thing that's the thing that really gets your goat on this thing is the fact that our gutless elected representatives, they use this, they allow it to happen, they do it because they don't have the guts to do it themselves, and then they act like, well, gee, we're faultless. It's not our fault. It's that government agency or that the president did that. And in reality, they've abdicated their role as responsible legal framework for our country, because they're the ones that are to create the laws.
And if they don't like what these agencies are doing, they could stop it like
Absolutely.
that. So here's what I'm going to tell you. I think that I'm optimistic about this, because there's a couple of things. There is the Madison Coalition, and the Madison Coalition is being run by a guy named Roman Buehler, and I'm speaking with him on Saturday at the Western Conservative Summit. And he's pushing a constitutional amendment, but I'm just going to read it to you because it gets to the very issue of what you're talking about. And I think we've got a couple of options. I think we could pass it congressionally, try to get a constitutional amendment, but there's nothing that would prevent Congress from passing this law right now. And it says, whenever 1/4 of the members of the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate transmit to the President their written declaration of opposition to a proposed federal regulation, it shall require a majority vote of the House and Senate to adopt that regulation. If we adopted that, we could change the trajectory of this country instantly. And that is why the Madison Coalition, our state legislators need to support it. We need our congressional representatives to support it. I describe Congress anymore, the Congress, the House and Senate, as kind of their own tragedy of the commons. There are 535 of them, but for the most part, nobody is held accountable for the fact that these regulatory agencies have run amok and that they're insane. So we need our governors. We need our governors to step up to the plate and protect their citizens from the federal government, and we need to adopt this Regulation Freedom Amendment. If we did that, Dan, so much of what I'm talking about would end, because these $100 million regulations, these $19 billion regulations, these $7.5 billion regulations, these $63 billion regulations, we could force 1/4 of the House or Senate to step up and stop it from happening, and we could change the trajectory of this country.
Well, you know, one of the problems we've got, though, is that so many of our elected officials are not the brightest and the best and quality people. And I saw that certainly at the county and the state level. The people that get elected to office, at least for the most part, are people that are glib, and they have an ability to BS, and they have the ability to make people smile. And most of the voters are so shallow that they allow people like that to get into government. And those are the people that continue to suck up to the federal government and the bribes and the grants and the revenue sharing and all that stuff, because they're lazy, and they want someone else to do all the heavy lifting, and they want to get reelected. And that's pretty much the same thing at the national level.
Well, but what I will say about that, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I also think that this issue has not been forefront the way that it should be. And that's why the other thing that I talk about is not the most sexy thing in the world, but I think it is critical to this, and that is tax reform, tax reform, tax reform, tax reform. And I'm not talking about the tax reform that they're discussing in Washington, D.C. right now. I think, again, we're talking about a fundamental shift. We should not be laundering our money through Washington, D.C. and through these agencies, and then have state governors standing there in a line with their hand out saying, gimme, 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 gimme. The money needs to stay in Wyoming. The money needs to stay in Texas. The money needs to stay in Montana and in Wisconsin and North Carolina and Louisiana. We need to have tax reform where we're not talking about the effective rate or the top rate being at 40% versus 35%. We need to be discussing 40% and 5%. The taxing authority should reside with the states. And that way, if California wants to be stupid, let it be stupid. That's one of the really good things about the experiment that our forefathers did. They identified, not at the time 50 states, but we ultimately became 50 states. Let Wisconsin do what Wisconsin wants to do. Let Wyoming do what Wyoming wants to do. Keep our money here. We'll pay for our own roads. We'll pay for our own health care. We'll pay for our own health insurance. We'll pay for our schools. We'll pay for our clean water, the implementation of the Clean Water Act. Let the states do it. The states should be doing those things. They're going to be more effective and policy-wise as well as cost. That's where the power should reside, and we need to start forcing our governors to demand that that power be returned to the states and stop asking for grants. Let's just stop sending all of our money back to Washington, D.C. and letting all those agencies steal as much of it as they can.
Oh, yeah, they're going to take their cut right off the top. And, you know, you're right. I mean, the Founding Fathers had the vision to understand that if a state wants to screw up, go ahead and let them screw up.
Yeah.
But the thing is it's competition. It's a natural process where if you don't like the state you're living in because you got a bunch of screw-ups there, then go to a state that you have low taxes, you have a reasonable government, you have decent roads. And it's a competition, and it was designed to be that way so the good would do well and the bad would fall by the way.
Well, and that was one of the things that I was very disappointed in the 2012 election when everybody kept trying to hang Romney care, if you will, around Mr. Romney's neck. The point of that was that Massachusetts had the right to attempt to come up with a universal health care. As a state, it had the right to do it. It could experiment. And what worked, worked. What didn't work, they had the ability to change. But the state could do whatever was necessary to adjust. A state has the flexibility to deal with those things. Look at where we are right now with Obamacare. The reason it is such a disaster to attempt to repeal is because now, instead of it applying to 7 million people, it's 330 million people. Instead of being allowed to experiment, you've got a 7 billion pound train barreling forward at 85,000 miles an hour, and there's no way to step in front of it and stop it. If you bite things off incrementally, which is what state-level type of policy decisions allow you to do, you can determine what will work and what will not work. Obamacare was destined to fail from the beginning simply because you could never administer a behemoth like that. At the state level we can, and at the state level we should. And that was the debate that needed to be had in 2012, and nobody had the guts to say it.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. Do you see any evidence that the Trump administration will actually roll back some of the regulatory state in a meaningful way?
They want to, and they've adopted 3 executive orders that are very, very good. I would like to work with the folks in D.C. and help them to do this. There are some that we've got to. We can't. Here's the thing: we can't fail anymore.
Right.
We don't
have the resources to.
We don't have the
much
luxury.
worse than we already have.
We are. I talked to you today. I did the research today looking at our debt. Our debt today is $19.965 trillion. In 1 month ago, on June 20th, when I was in Montana, it was $950 trillion. It's gone up another $5 billion in 30 days. Or how much is that? Yeah.
Well, and Harriet, the other part of that is that doesn't show what our unfunded liabilities are. Those are $128 trillion.
As of today, at least the information I have, and all of these numbers, you're going to get different numbers depending on where you go. So I always go to the same place because, I want to make sure my numbers are consistent. And total unfunded liability is $106,851 billion. Now, just the total U.S. debt, $67 trillion. That's $207,000 per citizen and $813,000 per family. This is insanity, pure insanity.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And incidentally, the reason we have that discrepancy in my numbers and your numbers is that they don't include in the unfunded liability the $20 trillion we have in
good point.
And that those together you get 120.
Just in budget debt. Just in our ongoing deficit with the debt spending, deficit spending. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time again. Would there be an opportunity soon to have you back so that we can finish this discussion? Because it just the fun never ends. We've got so much to talk about, and there is literally so much ground to cover. I would certainly welcome you back in the future. I'm sure we need to schedule something so that we can have you back maybe in a month or two, and we can talk about the rest of the story, as they say.
I would welcome the opportunity again. Perhaps everybody's ears need a bit of a rest from me, but we'll get together and we will continue our discussions. I enjoy your questions and your thoughts and your concepts, and I truly welcome the opportunity to bring this very emergent situation to a broader audience. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, and thank you for being so effective as a speaker on this subject. And I would suggest that our listeners, at least in the Denver area, should consider going to the Western Conservative Summit and it is being held this weekend at the Colorado Convention Center. And Harriet will be speaking at 3 p.m., and I would suggest that if you're in the area, it would be well worth your time and effort to attend that. And so with that, Kelby, I'll turn the broadcast over to you, and I will thank our listeners for joining us again this week, and look forward to next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m.